Picture this. You're running a business where your absolute most valuable assets eat, sleep, and require round-the-clock, highly specialized medical care. It's a business where acquiring a single piece of quote-unquote inventory can actually cost more than a luxury car. And here's the kicker. That inventory can live for decades, all while never actually being sold. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack what has to be one of the strangest, most fascinating business models in the entire entertainment and hospitality industry. Today, we're breaking down the economics of owning a zoo. Okay, let's dive into this. The zoo business presents a massive central paradox. On one hand, you're operating a public attraction that needs to generate revenue, right? Much like a theme park. But on the other hand, you're housing living, breathing creatures that really don't care if it's a slow Tuesday in November or a packed holiday weekend. They require the exact same specialized diets, precise climate control, and expert medical attention every single day of the year. So how on earth do you make the math work when your main attractions can't be traded, sold, or, just put in a warehouse when times get tough?
To answer that, let's just quickly walk through our financial perspectives for this explainer. First, we'll look at the zoo business paradox. Then, we'll cover the massive startup investments, break down the actual cost of daily operations, and finally, we'll map out the revenues and the hidden risks.
All right, part 1, the zoo business paradox. Let's understand this model.
Before we can even really talk about the money, we have to understand the landscape we're dealing with, because there is a fundamental divide in this industry. An accredited zoo is typically a nonprofit organization, and it has to meet incredibly strict standards for animal welfare, enclosure size, veterinary care, and active conservation programs. And these aren't just polite suggestions. These strict accreditation standards entirely dictate the massive cost structure of the organization. Because of this foundational conservation mission, a mid-sized zoo isn't just some park in the city. It's a sprawling, highly complex facility housing hundreds, sometimes thousands of animals across dozens of species on anywhere from 20 to 200 acres of land. And here is the number that truly separates a zoo from literally any other business on Earth. 70 years. Some of this living inventory can live for 40, 50, or even 70 years. Think about it. If you open a normal retail store and a product doesn't sell, what do? You discount it, you clear it out. But in an accredited zoo, bringing in an animal is a lifelong financial commitment. You are promising to fund its food, its housing, and its healthcare for decades. It is a completely alien concept to traditional business logic. Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 2. Massive startup investments. You can't just rent a storefront for this. You need land, and lots of it. A smaller regional zoo might spend $5 million just to acquire the land, while a large urban zoo that needs premium, accessible real estate, they might spend over $50 million before a single shovel even hits the dirt. But honestly, that's just the blank canvas. The truly staggering capital goes into the buildings. A single naturalistic, climate-controlled habitat for, say, an elephant or a big cat runs anywhere from $5 to $15 million. A dedicated veterinary hospital with quarantine facilities? That's another $5 to $15 million. And then you still have to build the walkways, the gift shops, the entrance facilities to actually handle the millions of guests, which easily tacks on another $20 to $50 million. So when you add all of that up, the land, 30 to 50 major habitats, the vet centers, all that visitor infrastructure, you are looking at a massive $150 million to $400 million startup cost for a modern accredited zoo. For the largest, most prestigious institutions out there, that number easily exceeds $500 million. It's a scale that's almost hard to wrap your head around, kind of like standing next to a fully grown giraffe. This sheer scale is exactly why most large zoos are developed by nonprofit conservation organizations that are heavily backed by public funding and philanthropy rather than just purely private capital.
Which brings us to Section 3, the cost of daily operations.
So you've spent your $300 million and you finally open the gates. Well, now the real spending begins. The crucial thing to remember about operating expenses here is that fixed daily costs, things like specialized diets, massive water filtration systems, expert veterinary care, they absolutely do not pause just because it's the winter off-season and nobody is buying tickets. For a mid-sized to large zoo, you're spending roughly $25 to $45 million every single year. And this brilliantly illustrates how a massive 60% of that budget is devoured entirely by animal care and staffing. When you factor in another 20% just for maintaining those elaborate habitats, keeping the water clean, the climate's perfectly controlled, you quickly realize that simply keeping the facility safe and running takes up almost the entire budget. Let's break down those human and healthcare costs a bit more because it's fascinating. A zoo requires highly specialized personnel. We're talking zookeepers, veterinarians, educators. A mid-sized zoo employs anywhere from 200 to 500 people. That costs about $10 to $25 million annually. Then, veterinarian and healthcare runs another $3 to $6 million for preventative and emergency treatments. And remember those strict accreditation standards we talked about earlier? They require mandatory multi-million-dollar investments into conservation and breeding programs, which adds another $2 to $5 million to the annual tab. It adds up incredibly fast.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we get to Section 4, revenues and hidden risks.
So with $35 million going out the door every single year in operating costs, how do they actually survive? For most visitors, the financial transaction begins and ends at the front gate with, say, a $22 admission ticket. But honestly, that price is an illusion. It barely scratches the surface of the lifetime care these animals require. To actually generate the $45 to $60 million a mid-sized zoo needs, they have to rely on multiple visitor revenue pathways. Yes, if 1.5 million visitors pay an average of $22, sure, that's $33 million in ticket revenue. But they absolutely rely on annual memberships for that predictable, recurring revenue. They need you to spend $5 to $12 on food, and maybe $3 to $8 on a plush animal for the kids in the gift shop. They rely on high-margin special events, those behind-the-scenes encounters. And most importantly, philanthropic donations and grants act as the critical lifeline. Without those major donations, massive exhibit expansions simply would not be possible.
So let's run the final numbers here. If a well-established zoo brings in $50 million in revenue and they spend $35 million in operations, they're left with a $15 million operating profit. On a $250 million initial investment, the payback period is roughly 16 to 17 years. Now, in the regular commercial business world, that is a moderate to long payback period. But as we've clearly seen, most zoos really aren't playing by normal commercial rules.
So the crucial point is understanding the fundamental difference between how these models operate. The vast majority of accredited zoos are nonprofits. That $15 million quote-unquote profit isn't being distributed to shareholders. It is immediately reinvested back into new exhibits, broader conservation programs, and better animal welfare. On the flip side, you have for-profit wildlife parks, which operate with fewer conservation obligations. By prioritizing crowd-pleasing species and minimizing a lot of that expensive, hidden conservation work, they can sometimes achieve a much faster 8 to 10-year return on investment.
But listen, both models face incredibly intense, incredibly unique business risks. A single high-profile animal welfare PR disaster, that can plummet attendance and instantly dry up donor confidence. There's also intense attendance seasonality. Rainy weekends mean absolutely zero ticket sales, but the lions still need to eat the exact same amount of expensive meat. And the absolute biggest hidden risk? Species longevity. A zoo might be financially responsible for feeding, housing, and medicating an animal for 70 years, long after that specific exhibit has lost its peak popularity with the crowds. It's this long-tail cost commitment that is practically unheard of anywhere else in the business world.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. Owning and operating a zoo requires hundreds of millions of dollars upfront for a business built entirely on animal welfare rather than pure profit maximization. Success here isn't just about squeezing a few extra dollars out of admission prices or pushing gift shop sales. It is about balancing a very genuine conservation mission with just enough visitor appeal to sustain funding for creatures that are going to live for generations. The bottom line isn't just measured in dollars and cents. It is measured in the actual survival of the species. Think about that the next time you hand over your ticket at the front gate. What are you actually funding?